Hello, in this video we're going to create a Service Fabric application that hosts an Express application, and we'll also compare it with the ASP.NET Core application. So you can go over the documentation yourself to find out why Service Fabric is pretty cool and why you might want to use it. In this video we're just going to focus on how to get a Node application set up because it's not as clear as the docs are for ASP.NET Core. So to get started, you will need Visual Studio. There's a free community edition. Download the Service Fabric SDK and tools, which allows you to run a local cluster and also includes like templating for Visual Studio. And then because we're also going to use an ASP.NET Core template, you're going to need the .NET Core tooling and CLI as well. So let's get started. We'll open up Visual Studio, and when you deploy, it executes some PowerShell, which needs to run under Administrator. So we'll start Visual Studio under Administrator Credentials, and we can go create a new project. It's going to be Service Fabric application. We'll call the Service Fabric application just application and make it easy, and we'll create the solution fabric. Do Express. So the first service we're going to add is the ASP.NET Core one, just because it's easy. We'll show you the kind of simplest working demo here. So just click Web API, click OK. This scaffolds out basically a standard ASP.NET Core app, and then also the associated Service Fabric application. So we can close the documentation. We can take a quick look at the solution here. There's just two projects. One is the ASP.NET Core, one is the Service Fabric application. The important parts is the application manifest here, which says, hey, I'm importing a service, and it's going to be a stateless service. And then if you check out the service, it says, you know, this is the port I'll be listening on, and this is my executable. The rest is basic ASP.NET Core out-of-the-box stuff. So as you expect, there's a simple values controller, and this is what we'll test real quick. So if we go ahead and press F5, it should build and deploy this into our local cluster, which I have the Cluster Explorer over here. So go ahead and click yes. Okay, so it has started the run async method of the service here. And if we can put a breakpoint in this controller so we can kind of prove that we're hitting it here. So we can see back in the Cluster Explorer, the application was deployed. This fabric colon is kind of an internal fabric URL, and it has a single service. So it was set to auto open its port. This 905, if you remember, is because its server manifest says 905 here. But the reason it says not found is because this is not listening to the root, but if we just add API values, then it should return those two strings. But we hit our breakpoint, so we can remove that, press continue, and the website returns. Now also what you want to know is this is hitting the service directly, but another way to access the same service is through the gateway or the naming service or reverse proxy, whichever word you want to use. They all kind of stand for the same thing. So if you look in here, it's at application/ASP.NET Core. So if we add that here, internally it will say, I want the ASP.NET Core service from the application named application, and translate this part of the URL into the localhost 904, and then forward the rest of the request. So this should, as you see, return the same two strings here. So now let's move on and focus on the Node.js app part. That's the interesting part here. So go ahead and stop, and I'm going to open up just a folder explorer of the solution. So remember, here's the Service Fabric app, here's the ASP.NET Core app, and we'll create a new folder to contain the Express app. I'll just call this Express Service, and we'll go in here and open Visual Studio Code. I usually use Visual Studio Code for editing JS projects, just a little more lightweight and typical working environment. So go ahead and open up the PowerShell terminal for this, and we're going to make this an npm package, so init, and it can't contain capital letters. Great, let's change that real quick. Call this Express Service. Okay, npm init. Just accept the defaults here. Add our name. So obviously the first thing we need to do is install our dependencies. So we need Express. We'll save that. I'm also going to use TypeScript. So we'll install TypeScript, and the types for Express, save those as development dependencies. Let's see, do I have a typo here? Yeah, misspelled install. And I misspelled that too. Okay. Okay, so now we have Express installed, TypeScript, and TypeScript, or types for Express. So the next thing I usually like to do is set up the workspace settings for Visual Studio Code. I just always do this as a practice. And this just instructs Visual Studio Code to use the version of TypeScript that's installed. That way, if different people are opening up the project in different versions of VS Code, it doesn't behave differently if they have different versions of TypeScript installed globally. So there's that. Next thing I like to do is set up some scripts. So this just exposes TypeScript compiler through npm. So you don't have to have it installed globally to use the CLI tools. And let's see, my startup file is going to end up being out of the dist folder. We'll have a build task, which just again calls TSC. You'll have a start task, which runs dist server. I think that will work. Okay. So now we need to set up TypeScript. So we're going to, at the bottom here, npm run tsc init. And this should generate our tsconfig file. And it's generally a good practice to use no implicit any. I will turn on source maps. It makes debugging easier. And let's also turn on strict null checks. This is kind of just opting in to new TypeScript features that make your code a little safer. Okay, and then since we're in TypeScript 2, we can use the new lib features, which tell it exactly what parts of this language it can use when it transpiles. And we're also going to set the out directory to dist, even though we're not really distributing anything. That's just what I like to do. Okay, let's go ahead and create a new directory called source and create a file in that called server ts. Let's open up the server. So here we're going to import Express. This is just the most basic hello world. I think this is directly from the Express getting started page. Now pay attention here where I defaulted to this 30,031 port. I'll talk about why that's important to note later. Okay, now let's need to build this. So we set up our build tasks in Visual Studio. Let's configure a task runner to use npm. And I'm going to add a new one called build. And it's just going to run the build. The reason I like to do it this way is so that anyone not using VS Code still has the exact same experience. So whether you run build for Visual Code or you run npm run build, they do the exact same thing. And that's why I set up those scripts here. So next, let's configure our launch. So we open launch, we'll configure it for Node. And it automatically detected that it's going to run the output file of dist server because that was what was in our main attribute of our package. But we have to change a little bit of other things here. So the files we're going to prefix with the workspace root, and it's going to be basically any file in the dist folder. And we're also going to tell it to use source maps. And the last thing we're going to do is tell it to build before it launches. So this will run the build task here, which will generate the output folder. So if everything's good, if I press F5, it ran TSC, it built, and it listened on that default port. So now if we open up our browser, let's go to 30,031, and we see hello world. So at this point, since we're running directly from the Node or Express root, this has nothing to do with Service Fabric, nothing to do with ASP.NET Core. This is pure Express application. So you can develop this completely in isolation. Now, I mentioned earlier that I was doing the Express or the ASP.NET Core service earlier and demoed that. And that was so I could allow Visual Studio to generate all the folder structure and then build my Express app inside it. If you were to build the Express app first, you would probably want to copy that whole folder inside of the solution file, because then you can have one repo that is actually tracking all the correct folders. So at this point we have our Service Fabric app, and it has a single service ASP.NET Core, and we want to add the node one. So in order to do that, we first have to do one last thing. So we need to copy the actual node executable, because we need something that can execute JavaScript. So that is going to be in Program Files, Node.js, Node. Just copy that into our Express service. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can right-click the Service Fabric Applications Services node, add New Service, and this time we're going to click Guest Executable. It will browse to the folder containing the Service Fabric application. Now we're going to use a link. That way we only have a single source of truth. If we were to choose copy, it would create a new duplicate inside, but we don't want that. So we're going to use node.exe, and we know that it should run the server.js file in the dist folder. And we also want to run it from the code package. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. And we'll rename this service Express, just to be clear. All looks good. Click OK. And you see it opened up the new service manifest. So basically that GUI just edited these values of the XML here. And another good way to view what actually happened is if you open up a kind of git diff view, whatever application you like. Let's see here. Should be Service Fabric. So when I created the original solution, it automatically added a couple commits for me with the scaffolded project. So what we're looking at now is actually everything that changed from adding the Node.js app. So you see it added the new service manifest and settings file, and it included a content element which is going to link all of the code in my actual Express folder into the Visual Studio project. It also updated the manifest. You can see it imported a new service and kind of declared as a stateless service. And these are just publishing configs. And then here's actually the rest of the code. So you noticed here it's actually picking up the dist files. I forgot to add that. So back in here, let's go back to the terminal. We'll add a git ignore file. And node modules is already excluded, but we'll just add it anyway. Okay, so now if you go back and refresh, you'll see the dist files are no longer included. So it is unfortunate that we kind of have to, you probably want to package that executable, but that's, I think, just a current limitation right now. Okay, and we don't really need to commit. This is a nice way to see what it does when you actually click Add Guest Executable. Let's go back to Visual Studio. So there's one more thing we need to do. I mentioned before that in the server I had put a default port here. Now, when you write in the service manifest, you have to declare what service or port Service Fabric is going to assign to your service. If you look at the ASP.NET Core app, you see they declared an HTTP input 9054. So we're going to do something very similar. We can in fact just copy this and put it over here. And we already have a name. The names have to be unique, and we will use the 3031 that I used in my app. And I also add URI shim, although it's a little bit redundant with the protocol. Okay, so basically what happens is this is going to tell Service Fabric that this guest executable is going to listen on 30.031, and then we also have to make sure our node app matches here, and we do. And if everything is good, I think we should be able to press F5 and you'll see 2 services in this application now. So I went ahead and press F5. And can go check out our cluster explorer. Okay, so here we have the existing ASP.NET Core service, and our new Express service is added here. And you'll see it is correctly showing our 3031 port here. And we click it, and yeah, it's Hello World, which is pretty cool. Now the next thing that we're going to try is replacing this with Express. What you see is now we know it's truly registered in Service Fabric because it's going through Service Fabric's basically gateway or naming service to map this address to this address. So that's basically how you set up an app. We can go a little bit more details about the differences between the two, because I think that's kind of interesting. So let's collapse everything here. One thing that I mentioned before is the ASP.NET Core app assigned it a port by default. Now, Service Fabric, because all these applications are being taken down and creating a new instance update dynamically in the cloud as VM's health changes or one VM gets full and a service needs to be moved, the ports are going to change. So one of the cool things is you can actually leave off the port and it will dynamically get assigned, or one will dynamically get assigned in the application range, which is declared over here. We say in one of these files, maybe not, but I think it usually declares like 3,000 or 30,001 to 40,000, and it will, any application can get one of those ports. But let's just demo this real quick, where we basically took out 9054, and everything should still work because inside the ASP.NET Core app, it is running the ASP.NET Core service, which uses a listener. And in here we get a context, and this context is passed in to this listener, and it basically tells it what port Service Fabric assigned to this service, and then dynamically starts the server on that port. So we'll go ahead and press F5. So you see how this time I told you that default range of 30,001 to 40,000, whatever it is. Instead of being on 9054, it just gave it the first available port, which is 30,001. And again, if we use the kind of naming service to do that, which is on 1981. it should still forward that through to the new port, which is values. And so the ability for that to work is because it's a .NET app, it can get invoked by the Service Fabric runtime with the service context. For the Express app, as far as I know, it has no way to tell the guest executable what port, and so that's why you are required to hard code it for guest executables. And by hard code, I mean specify this value here. Okay, that's about it. Thanks for watching.